Welcome to the Green Building Show, where we investigate green design and building trends throughout Australia.
Welcome to our new Green Building Show series, where we're focusing on the builds happening in the backyards of many houses in our cities, the granny flat and studio constructions. We're finding out how to go about it, what it might cost, as well as some of the risks and rewards. This week we're looking at where you can build a granny flat and the likely process with architect Nick Tedesco. Nick, granny flats and studios are springing up all over the place, especially in suburbs like this. Why?
There's a number of reasons to that. You can probably look at demographic or social impacts, but moreover, there's also this notion of co-generational habitation, where you use a single residential address and have a number of generations, grandparents, parents and children. Children as well, going to university, overseas travel, they call them the revolving door generation, where a single unit dwelling is too expensive. 1 or 2 bedroom units are very hard to find. So they're looking at trying to keep families together in a more cost-effective sense. And I suppose the state government looked into that about 5 or 10 years ago and came up with a couple of new SEPs, state environmental planning policies. One is the Affordable Housing SEP and the other one is the Complying Development Code SEP. And together you can analyse a property to see if a property is applicable, if you've got the space, because it's not just the actual dwelling itself, it's everything else that goes around it, the trees, landscaping ratios and percentages, access, and a sense of privacy for not only the people within that site, but also the neighbours. Setbacks are probably just as critical as area, because the setbacks are all different, from the front setback to side setbacks and rear setbacks. And it also depends on the size of the lot. That's the first place you start. How big is your lot? And then you apply the requirements specific to that lot, be it a 200, 300, 500, 600 square metre lot, whatever it is. There are a number of different scenarios. Once you've analysed what lot size you're dealing with, then you look at, if there is an existing dwelling, how much of that existing dwelling, how much of the site has been taken up by that existing dwelling. You need to work out the area that dwelling is, and then if there's some space left over, depending on what classification you're in, you can apply that to the outbuilding, granny flat, secondary dwelling, call it what you want. There are a number of different opportunities to seek an approval. But there are 3 basic types. There are ones that can be built or added within the existing dwelling. Even if it's a brand new dwelling, you can add that little bit and have it noted as a granny flat with its own little kitchenette and its own little facilities, and not deemed a dual occupancy necessarily. The second one is an attached, so it has its own separate entry, all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't have an internal connection. So that's in effect an attached granny flat. And the third one is the completely detached one, that's the one we typically push up the back. So, and they're probably, the first 2 tend to be family members, because you want to have that proximity, particularly with aged family. For example, I just did one or discussed a proposal for a grandmother who is turning 80 very soon. Very independent, strong-willed, wonderful human being, but the children, who are the parents of the children, the middle tier of the 3-level co-generational concept, are just concerned about the next few stages. So whilst they want to give them independence, at the same time they want to be there in case something happens. And that's a wonderful, wonderful benefit of the steps that have been developed.
Nick, should you be able to comply with these numerical requirements? I understand it could take as little as 10 days. Is it really that easy?
In theory, the steps have been set up to be that simple. However, particularly in Sydney, and particularly in an area such as this, as you can see, we have 4 corners, and all 4 of these have different conditions and contexts. So although the numbers are very simple and they are predicated on a prototype rectangular block, but if you look at your own dwelling, that you may have trees, or you may have an existing structure, you may have a neighbour that's done something quite different 30 to 50 years ago. That's your context and that's your condition. So you have to apply those numbers and those requirements to your site specifically.
So in theory, it's quick, it's fast, you could get permission very easily as long as you're complying. And this has obviously had an effect on the amount of granny flats and studios that have been built, particularly in a suburb like this. What effect has that had on the way that these secondary dwellings have been constructed?
It's opened up, the one thing that I've noticed more recently, it's opened up to a more mass-produced process, almost like a project home process, which there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. It becomes, you know, cost-effective. The repetition of construction means costs are kept down. The problem with it is, unlike the project home environment, where they still have to comply with approval processes unless they go the housing code SEP process, which is very stringent. The unique thing about the granny flat code is that you can put them in your backyards. And what we're finding is that there are two things that are happening, that either to put a window in to get access to sunlight may be detrimental to the neighbour. So you don't put the window in, but then the dwelling suffers itself. But the important or interesting thing is there doesn't seem to be any dialogue between neighbour and the installer of the granny flat, where a compromise can generally be sought. And that's what does occur when you go through the DA process, for example, which is probably why it takes so long. But it's six of one, half a dozen of the other. And I think that's what they're looking into, to try and install some method of dialogue just to, well, mitigate, not necessarily eradicate, these developing issues of affecting neighbour amenity and the like. Yeah.
So neighbours aside, what about the quality of the builds?
Well, quality is a subjective thing. There are two responses to that. One is there is a concept of industry standard, and that's the thing that's bandied around quite a lot. The other one is compliance with Building Code of Australia and Australian standards generally for habitable spaces. It really depends on what kind of quality you want, your definition of quality, and what you want to construct and then have as your built environment and live in it, be it for your grandmother, grandfather, teenage child, or even a tenant. At the end of the day, you are the landlord and you have to maintain that property. So to use a quality construction scenario means that maintenance will be reduced or mitigated. Whereas if you put something in sort of cheap and nasty, within 2 or 3 years, you'll either have to repaint it, replace the cladding, all that sort of stuff. So although it looks cheap, the old adage of don't look a gift horse in the mouth applies, but the other saying, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. You've got to look at the long-term requirements as well as the short-term cheaper costs.
So have a lot of cheap secondary dwellings been flung up, as it were?
I'm noticing it more and more. For example, the projects I get involved with, it has to have a relationship with the existing house. What I'm noticing is a lot of simple little, almost portable homes being installed that bear no relationship to the existing dwelling. It's incongruous. Apart from it not looking good, I'm just concerned about how it's being used internally. And I'd say probably, anecdotally 10–20%. There's always somebody in every positive scheme that takes advantage of a benevolent system. And I do believe that the affordable housing and everything else is a really wonderful system, but there are certain things that may need to be policed. It's how it's policed that's the problem.
So you're thinking of building a granny flat or studio in your backyard. If you could sum up, what are the main points you should be looking out for?
Firstly, I would definitely work out whether you can or can't. The simple process to that, seek what they call a 149 certificate from council. and that stipulates all the planning instruments or requirements applicable to your site. In some areas you just may not be able to, for example in heritage conservation areas and the like. So that's the first document. The second one I would recommend is to seek the advice of somebody who is competent enough to analyse that Section 149 and give you a direction, if nothing else. Once you've done that, obviously you'll have enough information to say whether it is beneficial or not. Sit down with the family or investment advisor or whoever and work out what budget or what cost structure you're happy to explore. Then if you're not going to continue with a professional, an independent professional person such as an architect, and you're going to go to what we term a design and construct, a builder type that they specialise, you still have those guidelines and those rules to protect your interest and make sure that it gets done right. So they would be the things. Before you speak to a builder, I'd probably do that little bit of research up front to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. And most importantly, questions of lights and space and air, and so it's not just a box in the back.